We will start a little bit late, but we finish on due time at 3 p.m. Local time. My apologize.
No problem. Pas de problème.
I think that we are now on live. So ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon or good morning. My name is Julien Rochette. I'm the director of the Ocean Program at IDDRI, and I have the pleasure to welcome you to this conference on planetary governance for sustainable recovery, co-organized by IDDRI and the European Chair on Sustainable Development of Sciences Po Paris. The session you are joining is entitled, Can Europe Still Play a Role to Advance Global Governance? It will begin formally in a few seconds. Just a time for me to remind you that you can ask your questions to the participants thanks to the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. And without any further ado, I have now the pleasure to hand the floor to Thomas Gomart, Director of the French Institute of International Relations, who is going to chair this session. Mr. Gomart, we are very pleased that you have accepted this role. Thank you very much again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julien. I'm very happy to be with you this afternoon for the ones who are in Europe. First of all, I would like, of course, to congratulate IDDRI for its anniversary, especially Michel Eddy and Sébastien Treyer and the whole team. I think that IDDRI in 20 years has acquired a unique position in the landscape of think tanks working on sustainable development and global governance. And congratulations to all of you. And I'm very happy to make this celebration with you today. I was asked, as you said, to moderate a discussion on Europe and its role to advance global governance. And what is very interesting in this session, it is the fact that we will have visions coming from Brazil with Mr. Celso Amorim, and a view from China with Professor Xu Ji. I will introduce them very briefly to remind all of you that Celso Amorim served a couple of times as Minister of Foreign Relations of Brazil. He was also Brazil ambassador to the United Kingdom and permanent representative to the United Nations. So given his very rich diplomatic experience, I think that he has real insight regarding global governance. And Professor Xu Ji is the CEO and president of the Energy Foundation China. He is very experienced in economics, energy, environment, climate change, and policy making. In his respective assignment, he served as Deputy Director General of China's National Center for Climate Change Strategy and International Cooperation. And he worked in his foundation since now many years. So welcome to both of you. I'm very happy to have this discussion with you. I have a set of very broad questions, and also we will interact with the other participants. But if you allow me, I would like to give 4 brief points maybe to introduce this discussion between the both of you. The very first one is a broad thinking about a sort of convergence we are all observing between 2 big trends, 2 big transformative trends. Obviously, the degradation of environments in its different aspects, climate change, the loss of biodiversity, pollution. And the other big trends, it is the propagation of technologies. And my very first point is to link these 2 trends, because I don't think it's possible to think about the future of global governance without thinking jointly about environment and technology. In both cases, we have a sort of acceleration, which is certainly at the core of the issue. Second brief point of integration, we are seated in Europe. We are facing a strategic rivalry between China and the US, which is more and more visible. in every sectors. And that's my assessment, and it is something obviously which can be contradict. But in my view, the US and China currently subordinate their respective climate and digital policies to their strategic rivalries. And that's something very uncomfortable for the others. Point number 3, Europe and others like Brazil or India, for instance, want to be trapped by this strategic rivalry between China and the US. And that's certainly also something reflecting in their conception of global governance. Fourth and last brief point about Europe itself. The big challenge for Europe in the coming decades will be the link between the so-called Green Deal, which has become the sort of new horizon for the EU Commission and the state members, the link between Green Deal and its ambition in terms of strategic autonomy. Second, the tension between a social demand, but also social resistance to accelerate energy transition. 3, the heterogeneity of socioeconomic situation within the EU regarding the energy transition. And also the fact that the EU is promoting, globally speaking, a tax carbon system, but as an incomplete European carbon market at the time being. So that was the 4 points I wanted to make to introduce this debate. My very first question to you, gentlemen, is a question of definition. Very simple one in a sense, but which could be also a tricky one. What would be, after the pandemics of COVID-19, what would be your respective definition of global governance? Celso, I will start with you, and after that I will turn to Professor Suji.
Thank you. May I? Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Gomart. It's a pleasure also to be with IDDRI and Ifri, also represented by yourself. I've been other times there in my already very long career. You can see by the white of the hair and of the beard that I'm now a kind of senior. I don't know if senior statement, but I'm more based on experience than anything else. Well, let me say, I mean, the questions are very broad. I think we are really living in a new world after the pandemic. The pandemic is not the only cause, of course, but it has been also a catalyzer for the other facts, very important ones. You have mentioned the rivalry between China and the United States. There are analysts, not to speak of the government, but analysts who consider these, I mean, like Graham Allison, for instance, in the United States, that deals with this rivalry, as he calls it, the Thucydides trap, because almost saying that war or some kind of conflict is inevitable. I hope he's not correct. But anyway, this is a crucial thing, a crucial change in the geopolitics in the world. The pandemics also has highlighted the need. It's not, again, not the only factor, but it has highlighted the need to find new ways of relations between human beings among themselves and between human beings and nature. So this implies new styles of life. Of course, we cannot be against progress and technological progress. We are far from the days of the Cartist workers in the UK, in England, when they broke machines. So we have to deal with that. But at the same time, I think this hectic life, traveling from one part to another, I myself did that, many other people did that, I think has to be rethought. I think we have not only the traveling, but I mean, all that's involved in that. I mean, I think the new world has to be less based on gain, material gain and consumption, and more on solidarity and a good life. A good life, of course, includes a Green Deal, a Green New Deal, if you wish, and many people speak of that. It's easier said than done, of course, because all the habits die hard. And I can see already in Brazil, I myself travel a lot between Rio and Sao Paulo, the two biggest cities, and I can see that the planes are all full. So it's easy to say, but more difficult to do. But anyway, I think there is a deep cultural change that has to take place. If you don't have that, you know, it will be very difficult. I mentioned that. I want to mention two other points, and then maybe I leave to you, or I don't want to monopolize the floor. The two other points that I want to mention: the geopolitical rivalry. I think it will not be a new Cold War, because the interlinkages between the countries are totally different from the ones that existed or didn't exist between the Soviet Union and the United States, for instance. I think there may be something positive in that for countries like, for the countries of Europe, but certainly for countries of Latin America, because it gives us options. It has to be understood that way. The option is not to opt for one model or another model, or for one kind of hegemony or another kind of hegemony, but to try to take the best for us. I mentioned that, and maybe as two final points. One is the role of Europe. Maybe that's another question, but I anticipate that the role of Europe, for me, it's very important, because Europe, of course, continues to be very important economically, technologically, and with all the aspects, but also Europe, and maybe I'm a bit Francophile, so maybe I'm wrong in that respect, but I don't know. Europe, provided you can deal with extreme right in Europe, of course, because that would erase what I'm saying. Europe has, let us say, more soft power, I would say, today than either the United States or China, to be quite honest. And I think in this respect, it can be also a kind of mediator in this broad new world in which we have to replace conflict by cooperation. And I think, speaking from Brazil, but also more generally from South America or Latin America and the Caribbean, I think there is also the dialogue between Europe, especially European Union, I would say, and South America or Latin America is a very important one. I'm not referring to the specific agreement that was signed, which I have much criticism about that, a lot of criticism, but more generally, when we think about a new world. And a final point, dealing with all these things requires a lot of institutional change. There is no way in which questions like climate change, global health, are dealt by the Security Council with the composition it has nowadays. We'll have to find some way of institutionalizing the role of the G20, maybe improving it a little bit, making it a little bit more African, for instance, and maybe a little less European in that respect, or Western in general, and so that we can deal with all these questions together with another one that was not mentioned by you, but it's, of course, built into any thought, which you cannot deal with climate change. You cannot deal with this complex problems of the digital world if you don't deal with poverty. Poverty is still a big problem for a great part of the world. So this kind of institutional change is something necessary. And what I think would be interesting, as it happened after the First World War or the Second World War, the pandemic is not the same thing, but it's a big crisis, to have a very important conference. Maybe the G20 could lead that, so that we can discuss very broadly all these questions, which are all interlinked. You cannot deal with climate change without dealing with poverty. You cannot deal with the digital world if you don't deal with, let us say, globalization, new liberalism, and models of development. And you cannot deal with that with structures that come from the post-Second World War, with the 5 permanent members and the rest of the world relegated to a very marginal role.
Thank you very much, Celso, for this first point. You said in terms of intention, less material gain and more solidarity. So it could be an objective for global governance. I turn now to Professor Zhu. Would you share what was said by Selim about the need for an institutional change? And what would be your definition of global governance right now? Is it much more to avoid the consequences of the strategic rivalry we have already mentioned, or is it much more to promote, for instance, joint dynamics to fight against climate change, for instance? How would you balance these two things?
Thank you very much, Thomas. And I would also like to, first of all, let me congratulate IDDRI's 20th anniversary. So this is a very important moment, not only for IDDRI, but also for the whole world, for France, for China, for Brazil, for the whole world. So coming back to the question about how to define the governance, global governance, I think, at least from my perspective, I have three dimensions to observe, to examine, and also to define the global governance. Number one, the analytical framework. I do not believe there had been a significant change of the analytical framework for global governance. Essentially, this framework includes three elements. Number one, defining responsibility at country level or non-party, or non-governmental, civil society, level. So that means what responsibility the entity you should have, how large, how small, and this is the first element of the governance. And number two, the power, or the driver, the power to make change in the framework of the governance. So at international level, we have a large country, we have a small country, we have rich country, we have poor country, developed or developing country, are very diversified. And to which extent a single country or group of country, they can make influence on the agenda setting, on the direction setting, etc., etc. So that can be regarded as the second element. The third element is the institutional arrangement, as Thomas mentioned. Some specific mechanism, legal basis, some rule, etc., etc. So no Paris Agreement is a form of the institutional arrangement to define, the shared vision, the common targets, the responsibility for different parties, and also the mechanism to achieve its goal. So this is a very general framework, analytical framework to understand the global governance. But so while I say these keep the same, before and after the pandemics, but I would also like to say, from the perspective of context, there has been a big change before and after COVID-19 pandemics. So what has been changed? Given my knowledge background of economics, I believe one change in the change in global supply chain. But for the moment, maybe it's too early to say what's the final. But we have observed some very obvious change already. In many very specific but important sectors. For example, metal and steel, or machinery, food, agriculture, or mineral products, etc., etc. This is one sectors we can see a big change, just because of the shock of the pandemics, and in the player, so they cannot work very well, and then the contract just shift to some other others. And then we have seen something out of order. I mean, for the routine supply chain, and these has been reflected in the trade and the investment. Another big change is about financial flow change, especially given the fact that the major economies, they just implemented the QE, very extreme QE policy. I mean, as a matter of monetary policy. And these had influence on the universal price of energy, including oil, gas, and coal. And the many economies, including European economies, I have no idea about the Brazilian situation, but in China, we are also faced with a shock of energy price increase, and these may lead to some reallocation of resources globally, and but certainly you can observe a lot of the change. And coming back to climate issues specifically, I also see no need to say Biden administration come back. These make very short-term change, and for the moment we see some joint momentum there, good momentum for further implementation of the Paris Agreement, for higher ambition commitment, also including, I mean, especially from Europe, will set up a more ambitious target, and the same thing in the States. I mean, 50% reduction by 2050, and also China. This is the first time in the history for China and for developing country to make commitment on, I mean, carbon neutrality. So those are some big change for climate agenda. So I do not want to exhaust the list. I would also say how to define the governance. We might have different priority level for different issues. So for example, anyway, for all the economies, recovery of the economy, normally they are top one. But the question is, in which direction you will recover your economy? It will be a green, if we can have, make recovery through green investment. So this will be a crossroad in the history. You can recover your economy, but in the meantime, to change your infrastructure, to change the pathway towards neutrality, to adopt a new technology. So these some issues, maybe we should put them on top one priority for policy, for social agenda, etc., etc. And in that way, we can move forward. So that means it seems to me now the immediate agenda for has been changed a lot. I mean, but certainly through definition of the responsibility, set up the shared vision. For example, 1.5 degree rather than far below 2 degree. So as a matter of the language of the Paris Agreement. And another important issue, I would say, huge investment in infrastructure, especially for the change of energy system, transport system, and in the meanwhile to combine the policy related to poverty alleviation, especially in developing countries. So those are some change for the global governance. Thank you. I stop here.
No. Thank you very much. That's very, very comprehensive. I would like to challenge both of you on the link between global governance, reform of multilateralism, and ecological transition. On the one hand, we have Celso, who underlines the need for some institutional changes in terms of global governance. For instance, transformation of G20 was one of his assertion. And on the other hand, Professor Zhu insisted on the importance of civilian societies to make this transformation. At the same time, he underlined also the commitments taken by states, in particular the last one taken by China. My question is double. On the one hand, do you think that it would be possible, with which direction would it be possible to use ecological transition as the main tool to reform multilateralism? The answer is, if the answer is yes, there is another question, which is if you observe the addition of the emission of gas by China and by the US, they represent more than 40% of the total of global gas emission. So from Europe or from Brazil, the answer could be also, but the big issue is between China and the US to some extent. So how do you relate, these three things, and how do you see ecological transition as a way for the transformation of multilateralism, or as maybe also a way of a big tension between China and the US? I start with Professor Zhu.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. That's a very good question. And I would say, yes, today's major agenda, global and international agenda, including climate change, COVID-19 pandemics, as well as the recovery of the economy, and how we achieve those policy goals. No need to say international cooperation based on multilateralism cooperation is very, very necessary and important. But unfortunately, we have seen the tension between China and the US in geopolitical terms. Certainly, I'm sure this is not helpful, even harmful for international cooperation. So the key issue here is the precondition of cooperation. So if we want to cooperate with somebody else, one precondition is the political trust. We should trust somebody else, and then we can cooperate with him or her. But now the poor geopolitical relation damage the political trust very much. And some colleagues might say, okay, well, we have very poor geopolitical relation, let's cooperate for climate. But I do not believe that. Why? Because it will be very natural for different countries. They have different views on human rights, etc., etc. And they can have different something disagreeable. But if their relation moved to not cooperation, no cooperation, no healthy competition, but confrontation. So this will lead to some impossibility for cooperation. So cooperation and confrontation cannot exist simultaneously. But I would say for cooperation and competition, they can exist together. So that means between China and the US, how we define the feature of the relation. So they can be cooperative, they can be competitive. So that's okay. That's very natural, and that will allow cooperation move forward. But if the tension go too far, become a sort of confrontation. This will make cooperation impossible, including cooperation for climate change. So having said that, U.S.-China relation is one of the most important bilateral relation countries, but also for the whole world. So I mean, the politicians from U.S. and China, they should be aware of a fact that, to manage and maintain a healthy relation between China and the U.S. will be not only the matter of U.S. and China, but also the matter of the whole world. They should set up the common goal. To make the relation healthy, and in order to ensure cooperation for global climate. This is my general understanding.
But that's a very, very important to have your vision on this point, because as you said, for the others, the consequences are very, very direct. Celso, I turn to you on this question on the link between global governance, reform of multilateralism, and ecological transition. Just after what was said by Professor Zhu, do you think that to some extent the ecological transition can also be an area of confrontation between China and the US?
Well, you know, Thomas, better than I do, probably because you are a scholar on that. International relations have always been a mixture of both. It's a mixture of conflict and cooperation. We never had international relations based only on conflict or based only on cooperation. The question is how the mix goes and how we enhance the role of cooperation. And I would agree with Professor Zhou that trust is essential. And of course, I believe countries like ours and Europe can have a role in inducing this growing cooperation. I think, on the other hand, I would say, maybe a slight, not disagreement, but a nuance with Professor Zhou. I agree with him that trust is essential, but it is possible also sometimes to go from the particular to the general. So you cooperate on climate, and if you have a good cooperation on climate, that can help cooperation on a broader way. But I want to, coming from the South, because China is part of the global South and at the same time is a superpower nowadays, so it's a slightly different situation. So if coming from the South, I agree it's very important that the United States and China cooperate. It's certainly the most important relation in the world today, bilateral relation. On the other hand, I would say, as a kind of almost an alert, not to see, because this happened in the past. Even when the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for instance, was signed, it was the Soviet Union and the United States having a kind of condominium defining what should it be for the world, and then it was imposed on the world. Well, in the beginning, for different reasons, countries like France were against, but it was fast enough to have its own force de frappe, and then it changes its mind. But anyway, it doesn't matter. What matters is that this has, although the cooperation between the two is essential, I think countries that have some sort of soft power, some sort of penetration in other parts of the world may help. And I give you two examples that involve, to some extent, Brazil. The creation of BRICS. BRICS is very important for developing countries, very important for Brazil, was accepted and very much supported by China. But it started, actually, I'm not referring to Jim O'Neill's phrase, which is older, but as a forum, it started with a proposal by Sergei Lavrov to me. Because why? There was at the time already Russia, India, China, but maybe Brazil and then later South Africa could bring a little more soft power, a little more international legitimacy to this idea of multipolarity, not only in terms of power, but also in terms of broader objectives. And I think the same role can be played by Europe and European Union. I think for me, call it ecological transition if you wish. I think we have three big problems in the world today, and I would summarize them. I'm not even describe them. It's climate change, which is the ecology, but it's broader. It's global health, which are also linked to ecology, but again, it's broader. And inequality. Inequality is a big problem. So I think you have to deal with these three problems simultaneously. And you have to deal also in this problem as multilaterally as possible. I know I did it. So I don't think it is appropriate for the Security Council with its present structure to discuss on that or take decision on that. And I don't think it's appropriate for the, so it's a paradox. Like in that, since I'm old, I think of the period of what we call I forgot the name in English now, this lack of tension, this diminution of tension between Soviet Moscow and Washington. Well, we welcome that, but at the same time, we want to be called to describe how the new world should be. And I think this is the important part. It's fundamental that China and the United States have good understanding, but it's fundamental that this understanding is not only a bilateral one that imposed on the world. And if I may make a final word, which I mentioned in the beginning, and I'll finish with that very, very, very short. Don't underestimate the danger of extreme right in the world. I mean, when we see nowadays what happens in Brazil with a denialist approach to health, to climate, to health, and that happens also in other countries, which are very much where the extreme right is rising. Trump may come back. Biden is okay. But Trump, or to some extent at least okay, but Trump may come back. So this is a deep question. Why is the extreme right growing so much, and how should we deal with it, with the challenges that it poses? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Celso. I would like to refocus our discussion on Europe and having your assessment of the Green Deal promoted by the EU Commission and state members. Very briefly, how do you assess this Green Deal? Do you think it's realistic? Do you think it's feasible? Do you think it can be a driver for others? Or are you more skeptical about the ability of Europeans to implement this Green Deal, given the economic and social, I insist on the word social, situation in which we are? We have all in mind, you know, the social unrest related to the increase of the energy in the last years, for instance, in France, but not only. What is happening in the UK, for instance, is also reflecting that. So I would be interested in having your sort of brief and concise assessment of the Green Deal, which has become a sort of also a slogan for the EU to present itself abroad on the international scene. After having received your assessment, I will turn to Constantin Lu, who has some question from the participants, because we will have we have still have 15 minutes before concluding this discussion. So I start with you, Professor Zhu, about your assessment of the Green Deal. Is it serious, according to you?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. My answer is very positive for Green Deal from Europe. I think in many terms, number one, I think this is the first among the major economy or economic groups. This is the first deal or the first very comprehensive strategy to show the targets, more ambitious target. Although I do not know if this is the ultimate ambitious target, but it is more ambitious target compared to the previous NDA or previous target of Europe. Number two, I also saw the pathway to achieve the targets. I mean, sector by sector, very concrete description of, I mean, how to achieve. And besides, I also have a very strong feeling. I mean, this Green Deal has been highly supported by the citizen in most of the member states. Having said that, and also linking with the previous performance of Europe, I mean, including achievement of its goal in the last round of commitment period, I felt that Green Deal is convincible. It's convincible, and from my experience to work in China, to inform the policymakers with our research result and also knowledge, as well as some information from international community, I saw very real and very direct impact on Chinese stakeholders. So it's very very often, I mean, in China, when we discuss policies, we say, oh, just let's make a reference of European policy, I mean, drawing from Green Deal. And especially the more concrete implementation plan, I mean, launched last summer. And together with the Green Deal, they are very convincible. I think they play a leading role in the whole world to show, oh, this is the more ambitious target. This is the pathway or the roadmap for European country to achieve. And because Europe is a major economies in the world, I mean, through its trade and investment and personnel exchange and technology, education, culture, etc., etc. And based on that, these really make impact. Okay, I stop here.
Thank you very much. Celso, your assessment, if you can be quite concise, because I would like to keep the last 8 minutes for the question coming from Constantine, including your response. So Celso, yours, if you can quite concise.
Well, I will follow the conclusions of Professor Zhu in terms of specifics. He's much more knowledgeable than I am. What I would like just to add is that Europe has indeed what happens in Europe has a big impact in the whole world because of the soft power, as I was mentioning before, depending on the kind of government also that you develop in Europe, of course. And this is already having an impact. I'm not saying it's only Europe, but it's also Biden, it's also other agendas. But for instance, the ecological, so to say, the ecological concern has never been so clear in the programs of political parties in Brazil. I speak for the Workers' Party, which I know better than now. And I think this is already a consequence of all these things that you're mentioning. So I think I would stop here because it could be too long, and I think you asked me to be concise. I will be concise. By the way, Brazil and China are part of a same group called BASIC, which discuss together these questions in the broader arena of the Copenhagen process.
Thank you, Celso. So I turn now to Constantin to raise a question. Constantin, the floor is yours.
Maybe just a moment. I have to leave at 10 till. So
I am aware about that. Don't worry. Okay. You will be completely free 1 minute before.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Constantin, the floor is yours.
Thank you for your very interesting interventions. One of the questions I have is the European Union's normativity encounters limitation. Europe can export its values of human rights, democracy, and rule of law through conditionality in preferential trade agreements, but not to the powers of global governance like China, Russia, Turkey, or Brazil. How do these countries perceive, and especially Brazil and China, how do these countries perceive European influence in the world?
Celso, you can start maybe because, but depending on the duration of your answer, you will be late or you will be on time. So I would suggest you also to be concise.
I'm very concise. The influences is positive. For instance, one of the greatest achievements here in our region was the creation of Mercosur, which is, I mean, don't want to elaborate on that. I mean, the process of regional integration, which by and large influenced by the European experience. So I don't want to underestimate that at all. I have to say that in Brazil, the European influence in elites, at least, was much bigger than the United States. It has changed in more recent times with the emergence of a new middle class, which is more, whose attention is more directed to Miami than to Paris, which is unfortunate in my opinion. But in any way, but of course we are open very much. I mean, I was someone personally involved in the space cooperation agreement with China and with buying submarine nuclear powered technology for a nuclear powered submarine from France. So I feel very, very. What I want to stress is that what interests us from looking from Brazil is a world that's more multipolar as much as possible. We know the reality is the reality. You cannot, and in that respect, I would emphasize. You mentioned quickly the role of BRICS in this context, but I would again say in terms of values, in terms of not the values as they are practiced so much, but the values as they are exposed. Because when you see certain attitudes in relation to migration and other questions, protectionism, you feel, well, do what I say, but don't do what I do, and that of course is a limitation. But in general, I would say that the cultural and political influence, for instance, elections now in Germany are being followed in Brazil almost as if it were happening in our neighbor, because the extent to which that can change the geopolitics in our thinking, maybe positively, the geopolitics in Europe and the way that we see the world. So I will stop there, and I think Europe should continue playing this role in reinforcing a multipolar world, which, and I will insist on that, requires institutional change, both in areas like the G20, but also in the more, let us say, formal United Nations structure.
Thank you, Celso. Professor Zhu.
Very briefly, but certainly this is a very comprehensive, very long discussion. But one thing with very limited time, I would say, just want to let you know, in China, my observation in China's society is more and more open to discuss this kind of issue. Like, for example, human rights. I remember 20 years ago, or even 30 years ago, it was very sensitive to talk about human rights. But today, the situation is very different. But I'm also aware of the fact, the understanding, the definition about human rights and about the Taiwan, for example, Taiwan issue, or Hong Kong, or even Xinjiang issue, seem to be very different, not only between Chinese government and the Western government, but also between normal Chinese citizen and the many foreign think tank or media. Those are the facts. Those are the facts. To be honest, my individual opinion is, so we can keep very honest, frank, very straightforward discussion or even debate on that. So that's fun. So different people, different country, they have agreement, they have disagreement, common opinion or different opinion. That's very natural. But one thing we should be very careful in how to manage this kind of disagreement or different view, or even dispute, political, trade dispute, etc., etc. So maybe, from the perspective of international cooperation, maybe true respect to each other should be the precondition. And also so let's do better and more communication and deeper communication to share the information, to share the fact, to make stronger transparency. That should be very helpful. And otherwise, sometimes I think we are out of the management of the disputes, and these will damage the very necessary political trust, and then damage the necessary cooperation for COVID pandemics, for climate change, for economic recovery. So I mean, the key is not the difference of understanding or disagreement. The key is to respect to each other, to enhance transparency, to share information, and then to manage the dispute and the disagreement. This is my understanding.
Thank you very much. We are 2 minutes. We are together to celebrate IDDRI anniversary. So in a few words, I would like each of you, starting with Celso, what would be your piece of advice in terms of research and activity for IDDRI for the next decade? What should be, in your opinion, the topic on which IDDRI should focus its efforts for the next decade? Celso, in a few words, and we will conclude with Professor Zhu just after.
Very few words. Concentrate on the 3 big questions, whatever order: inequality, climate change, global health, and do it in a multipolar and multilateral way.
That's a great program. Professor Zhu.
So I would say just to keep its very honored tradition as it did in the past 2 decades, and then to keep independent, to keep fact-based and analysis-based. So I really wish he will make another round big achievement.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you, both of you, for this discussion. I think we could continue it, but it will be in another circumstances. I would like also to thank and to congratulate IDDRI once more time. We are separated, you know, in special terms, but I think that all of you could applaud the 2 panelists and could applaud also IDDRI. And Celso, you are on time. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
Bye-bye.
Okay, au revoir.